The panelists have done extremely well in terms, I think, of answering those questions about successes and challenges, looking at some of the advice towards the strategy, looking at areas that they used as indicators. So I thank them all very much. I'd like to have a short discussion with panelists, as we said we were going to do. And one of the questions that really came up with me, and I'd like to focus first on this whole area of accountability, of measurement, and a couple of the panelists talked about it. Ian suggested the challenges of having a consistent database, and that's one that, we've tossed around for quite some time between provinces, within our province, and between federal and provincial territorial jurisdictions. Brian has talked about having that benchmark within his province, and we've looked at it in a couple of other areas too. So the question goes out to our panelists. Is there some advice as we move forward at a pan-Canadian level that we can look at achieving some of those consistent measures so that we can have a baseline that goes across country? And something that gives us an area to measure back on, or if you'd like to add on to some of the indicators. Maybe start with you, Ian, or are you comfortable with that?
Sure. So what I'd say is that for those of you that don't spend your days looking at labor market development agreements and workforce development agreements, you probably know, or you might know, that the provinces and territories, or I think with the exception of Quebec, have all renegotiated the labor market transfer agreements, and inside there, and Eppo Martins, I think, is here somewhere. Yeah, there he is. Oh, someone's pointing him out. One of the pieces inside there is around common indicators for the program. So BC, I can speak for BC, we've signed on to that new reporting framework, and that's really going to, over the next few years, really begin to show some interesting trends, and so I think there's some positive, that comparability will come in part through that, but at a national level, we really do need to make sure we have that consistent data set at the broad, that we can compare province to province as disaggregated as we can possibly get, and look at different disability types so that we can measure our success, but also look to where we can make changes.
Okay. I think, Brian, did you want to?
Just wanted to say that that's a really good point about different disability types and the intensity of the disability. One size is definitely not going to fit all. That's one of the things about research around employment is every person has assets and deficits and challenges, whether they have a disability or not. So we're going to have situations where people can adapt to situations, and the other way around in terms of employment. So I guess you need the data, but you also need to have a sense of getting inside the data, what's going on, and right down to the geographic location is a good way to go as well. It's not just at the provincial level, so sub-provincial is good to have as well.
Yeah, thank you. Jennifer.
So as mentioned, we have this draft outcomes framework, and one of the ways that makes it less scary, I think, for government and some of the folks who are going to be pointed at on accountability, is to focus on the system level stuff. So it's not all like, okay, so what is the government's response? It needs to be system level. And so that's the real importance of the Statistics Canada data. And so we're really kind of hoping this ends up with a partnership with StatsCan, because we've really relied on things like the employment rate, labor force participation, there's a bunch of educational measures, and we're building all of these in, but then from there we're going to be hopefully drilling down so that each of the stakeholders, whether it's government or community, can start to see how they're contributing to change at the system level. And so I think it's so important that we have both of these working together as opposed to just high level, and then we don't get to understand how we're actually going to effectively at the operational level turn the dial, so to speak. So.
Super, thank you. And that kind of dovetails right to another question I was wondering about, and ask the panelists, like, The idea of a pan-Canadian, the draft disability and work strategy, does that lend itself from a provincial perspective to prospects of new partnerships? You mentioned Stats Can. I'm wondering too, in terms of the whole myriad of comprehensive supports, and they're coming from all so many directions, or other areas of the pillars, are there new partnerships that you see from provincial level that open up to you through the strategy? Anyone can jump in.
I'll venture
Sorry,
a response.
Ian, and-
I think it does. Certainly the relationships between provinces are really important with employment. I mean, when you think about the different qualifications and standards of different occupations from province to province, I think this is a way to generate conversation and partnerships around that kind of partnership, but also to challenge each other as sister jurisdictions around the progress that we're seeing in our various areas. So I do think it does
Yeah.
generate that possibility for sure.
Anne?
Yeah, I was going to say pretty much the same thing, and I think there's also the need within provinces to really look at how we can strengthen partnerships. Right now in Nova Scotia, there's a lot going on in the employment realm, but it's being done by different departments and different organizations, and there's no sort of cohesive thing, I guess you could say, that ties everybody together. So I think having some sort of a strategy or having some sort of a framework is going to be important. And I agree with Ian that, you know, we're always looking to see what our counterparts are doing and where are the best practices happening. And, you know, I think provinces also like to look to provinces that are of the same size as theirs. So I know we always do a lot of comparison with provinces like Saskatchewan and Manitoba that are similar in size. You know, how are we managing things in a rural province where so many people do live in rural areas? So there's lots that we can learn from each other, I think. So I think partnerships are key.
Super. Well, I've got about 25 other questions, but I'll ask you to think about them, you know, throughout the rest of today and tomorrow, because there's so many. You know, we heard about individualized funding. Is that a way that we can kind of broach bringing programs to be more, support programs to be more cohesive with each other? We've heard about how do we reach out to rural areas? How do we work with employers? We've had a challenge in terms of engagement, real engagement with Indigenous communities and with youth. We've heard about from one panelist that tied the dollar commitment, the $10 million, to a way of supporting employers. How important is it to have significant funds attached? How do we move into more impact assessment and away from the medical models, and is that another way of making support systems more cohesive with each other and have a commonality of vision, and many, many more, and I know you've got more, and we have just about 10 minutes, 8 actually, to hear your questions or thoughts or ideas. So I invite anyone in the audience to direct a question to any of the panelists. We'll start right over here with Tony.
Hello. It's exciting to be here and that we're talking about this subject. It's incredibly important. And it was nice this morning to hear from the Deputy Minister, Yasmin, about that the federal government is considering to hire 5,000 people in the next little while. I don't think she defined when and where and how. I'll speak to just one particular area and maybe ask a question. And I heard Brian Saunders spoke to it as well, that he talked about real jobs for real people. And that I hope the strategy will show some things like that. I think the federal government dispensed with some of its responsibility or its leadership over the past few years. And as Yasmin this morning said, the federal government is the single largest employer in this country. And the jobs are as diverse as one can possibly imagine. It is I speak to this from a person who worked in the federal government for 30 years, and I worked in recruitment of persons with disabilities and others. I think there's really needs that the federal government to step up and be a leader. While there is, great panelists here from the different provinces, the federal government, I think, has to step up to the plate, basically, and make it, a time, a place, when, and the numbers of jobs that they are creating as to how people can apply. Because it is a very confusing field out there, and I would defy anybody in the room explain to me, and I worked in this field, how you would apply for jobs in the federal government. There is no single agency. There's different ways of applying. There's different methods of applying, and very few, places you can go face to face. So I just want to maybe the panelists speak to about, and I know you're from representing provincial bodies, but how the federal government should step up to the plate. And I think the federal government, as I said, has dispensed with some of its responsibility in that area.
Any takers on that one? It's pretty hard to speak on behalf of another jurisdiction, that's for sure.
Gee, Tony, that's a real
Roseanne.
easy one.
Yeah, really.
Go ahead.
Do you want to?
I'll give it a try. And when I thought about sort of the advice that, I didn't get to that. I was long-winded apparently this morning. The advice that I would give in sort of implementation, the opportunity for partnership and what we can learn from each other, I think, is really the strength of what's offered here. We heard some concerns about the mandatory sort of role, whether we're going to roll it out and how. And we've had discussions with our Human Rights Commission about a new approach to even their field, and it's more collaborative. How do we get people to understand what the right thing to do is and them want to do it? And that's really what I think this strategy offers. I think if the federal government can offer leadership in providing resources and direction with StatsCan and their partners and others, taking the leadership on their own public service and starting to look at other ways, whether it's key employers or partners that they have, that they can start offering best practices, research grants. There's lots of opportunities for leadership, and I think they are taking steps. But one, again, it's about promotion and education, letting folks know what you're doing, the coordination and navigation. We just have to start to open up the space to talk more and share that information better. And I think it's on all of us, as opposed to just the feds, to step up, to welcome that conversation and be part of that space.
Yep. Just very briefly, I'd just like to add to that too, in term we heard from Deputy Minister LaRoche, and I think that Tony, I believe the stepping up has started just by having a Deputy Minister at that level and looking at public service and accessibility together, which I find quite exciting. I think too that we have many systemic barriers within our process of hiring. So in terms of how do we apply, where's the interview, just the electronic systems themselves. So we really have to pick those apart and be able to change that whole system. So I'll go to next question very quickly. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Margaret Oldfield. I'm a researcher, and I have a couple of suggestions for disaggregating data, just to get them on the table here. You mentioned rural and urban is one disaggregation, making sure that we have data on the differences between rural areas and cities. Age is another aspect. I'm looking at the employment of people with disabilities across their lives. And gender, of course, is very important, and all the other aspects of intersectionality that the strategy mentions, that we cover data, we collect data based on all those aspects of intersectionality. I also wanted to throw onto the table, responding to Tony's comment, or triggered by Tony's comment, that federal government is the biggest employer in Canada. Mm-hmm. Governments, provincial governments, municipal governments, all across Canada are big employers. And yet our strategy talks mostly about business. But I think we should be looking very closely also at engaging governments as employers, as models for employing people with disabilities. Also the third sector, nonprofit organizations, although they don't generally have a lot of money, have a mandate, a socially conscious mandate, and may be more receptive to working to increase the employment of people with disabilities. Those are just some suggestions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. That's very helpful, and thank you for your thoughtfulness. Anna, do you want to
I was
quickly
just
say?
going to add one thing that I think it's also really important, as we heard this morning, to hear people's stories. And I think as the federal government starts to roll out, you know, their hiring plans and people are getting hired, to be able to tell those stories and to be able to tell how those individuals have been hired, the processes that they used, and you know, it was very powerful this morning seeing a deputy minister up here with the lived experience of having a disability, and I think those stories need to get out there and need to be told so that other governments and businesses can see that it's possible to do.
Thank you, Anne. We've got time for one more question. It's coming from this gentleman.
Hi, thank you. Vince Russell from British Columbia. I just had a question. I was happy to see that Newfoundland had some social marketing in there. And I do think that if we want to, as was mentioned, weave this into the fabric of society and increase buy-in, that there should be some consideration for social marketing. It provides an opportunity for all of us to align our messages and to gain some benefits, smaller groups lining up with larger ones. So I just wanted to kind of ask Newfoundland a little bit about what approach you took around the social marketing and what messages that you wove in there.
Henry.
I can give you more specifics, but generally it's been trying to promote positive images of disability. Again, real people in real communities living real lives, less about the charity model and more about just the social model of disability. So the content of that social media has very much been driven again by our partners, very consultative process, and then we use the government mechanisms to kind of share that. But each of those organizations also has its own mechanisms for sharing. So I guess a two-step process. One, we're all happy with the content, and that's a collective exercise, and then we use the technology available to get it out there.
Okay. Thanks, Henry. And with that, I'll thank the panelists. You did fantastic in very short time. And I do remind folks that panelists are around for the next day and a half, either here in person or still remotely. We'll connect you. So if you have other questions, if you want to further some of the discussion, please keep it going. This is what it's all about this next 2 days. So thank you for your learnings and your sharing, and it's very much appreciated.